I'm going to go through the Modular Scan Vegetation for Games workshop. So we'll cover a few different things and different workflows and methods that I use to build a scene. I'll also provide a link to the scene with a code to download it for free if you'd like. And I'll just kind of like start, I guess, poking around and showing you guys kind of how things were constructed and just my approach to the vegetation. So yeah, so as Tim mentioned, I'm a senior environment artist at Respawn Entertainment currently, um, and this is the overall content of what we're going to go through today. So I'll do a brief intro, just my journey into games, my career thus far, and then we'll jump right into the live demo. So my journey, I think this is just interesting. Everybody has a different journey, so I'd like to talk about mine. Um, I went the traditional college route for art school. I went to a school in Toronto called George Brown College. I did a 3 year program there, and it was actually like fast tracked a bit because I did some semesters through the summer, so I got through it in a year and a half. Um, and When I was in school, like I kind of took things really seriously. I did everything I can to kind of get ahead as much as I can. So like I did, I booked a trip to E3 and I went to E3 on my own, and um, I had emailed the E3 coordinators, and I said that I was a member of George Brown College's. It was like kind of like the game development committee, which I was a part of, and at the time we were doing like monthly kind of get-togethers to get all the students together to do various different activities like play games. We would have like a multiplayer um, uh, LAN party. So I got in through like it wasn't like press, but it was kind of like there's like a a lower tier of press, I guess, and so I got into E3, and then I was a member of the IGDA, which like George Brown College gave us all IGDA membership. So I would attend the IGDA Toronto meetups, which also happened once a month. And I had found this thing called the IGDA Scholars, the scholarship program, and I applied for that, and I got in, and basically what that provided me was a trip to GDC in my graduating year, and it was all expenses paid. I had to take care of my own accommodations, but as far as like the expo badge, we had a bunch of other things. Like we got to meet with Microsoft, we got to meet with Sony, we met with Double Fine, um, we met with Zynga. There's so many studios that we met with. I can't even remember them all. And I also got paired up with a mentor. Mine was like Pat Redding. He was the uh, like game design director, I want to say, or game director. It was game director on Splinter Cell at the time, and Splinter Cell was just starting up at the Ubisoft Toronto studio. The Ubi Toronto studio literally just started. They were just framing the walls, and they had it was like 5 people in the studio at the time. So yeah, so I this was in 2010 when I got the scholarship, and I went to GDC in 2011, and yeah, this was like a pivotal moment for me because this is where I met the people that would give me my first job in the industry at UB Toronto, and so go into the next slide. So yeah, in my career, so I started at UB Toronto. I spent a decade there. I spent just over 10 years at UB, and this past June, I transitioned to Respawn Entertainment, the LA studio. So I've been there since June 2011. At UB Toronto, I worked through various different roles. I'll talk about that in a minute. I've also taught at a couple of colleges in Toronto. I taught at Seneca College and George Brown College. George Brown College is where I studied. I'm still teaching there now. I teach one class a week, and it's um, a local college in Toronto that is really great. I have a lot of sentimental connection to George Brown College, and yeah, like I mentioned, I teach there to this day. So I've been teaching there for about 7 years. Um, I've also mentored at with a couple of different organizations. I mentored with the Mentor Coalition, and I'm currently mentoring with Skilltree. Um, Mentoring is basically an extension of teaching. It's just one-on-one live workshops where we dive into specific workflow techniques. So, like, I'll teach one-on-one Speedtree, one-on-one, trim sheet techniques, modular workflows, both mesh and texture workflows, vegetation. Essentially, just helping people build scenes, build assets, sharpen their workflows, update their portfolios, and there's also general mentorship guidance, etc., packed into that. But it's mostly one-on-one live workshops. And these are the games I've contributed to. So I started with Splinter Cell Blacklist as a modeler. I then worked on Far Cry 4 and the Shangri-La content in Toronto as a level artist. I did a super short stint on Assassin's Creed Chronicles in between projects, and which was the side scroller game. And then I transitioned to Far Cry Primal as a lead artist. So we were essentially just starting to kind of expand our experience with the tools to build Far Cry, and we had a slightly larger mandate on Far Cry Primal, and I was a lead artist. So I had, I think it was 3 or 4 artists under me, and I took a third of the mandate, the Toronto mandate, as far as art goes. I was also a lead artist on Far Cry 5, and then I was like a lead artist slash associate art director for Far Cry 6. I transitioned to associate art director, I think, like a third of the way through production. So I kind of worked my way through all of these roles, and then when I uh, joined Respawn to work on Star Wars, I took the role as a senior environment artist. At Respawn, there's much more of a flat structure. There's not a whole lot of management. Like we do have a lead environment artist at the moment, and 2 art directors, but it's more of a flat structure, and so yeah, I joined, and it's a much smaller team, and this is where I'm at currently. I'm having a great time, and I'm building the sequel to Jedi Fallen Order. So really exciting. I can't wait for people to see it. Yeah, it's really exciting. And yeah, as I mentioned, I'm also currently mentoring with Skilltree, and this is the one-on-one workshops and hands-on kind of mentorships. Happy to answer any questions on any of that in a bit. So yeah, so now let's start talking some vegetation. So the first thing I wanted to talk about was this scene, and I'll provide a link to this scene at the end of the workshop. And I just kind of wanted to go through like how this scene was constructed, a bit of how things were put together, um, kind of like the behind the scenes. It's a bit slow right now. I've got a bunch of stuff um, open, so it's running a bit slow. So forgive any lag. But yeah, so I wanted to go over this scene and go over some of the inner workings and how this scene was built. I'll provide a link to this scene as well as a code to download it for free. When I built the scene, I didn't really, I never intended on making any money off of this scene. I wanted to put it up for free, but when you upload something past a certain amount of gigabytes on both Gumroad and ArtStation, they do require you charge something. Like I literally can't put it up for free, but I'm able to provide a discount code, so I'll provide this for free. So yeah, so we'll go through the scene, kind of how things are put together, look at some of like how we can cut some corners, especially in a scene that you're just trying to make to look beautiful, and we'll go over, some standard techniques that we apply to our big budget productions that I've also applied to this scene, but also some stuff that I recommend people do when they're working on personal scenes that are just like beauty scenes and they're meant to kind of flex their artistic muscle. Just some things that I would recommend doing in those cases that are perhaps, a bit more difficult to do in a production because we have all the constraints and budgets and timelines and all that stuff. All right. So the first thing I wanted to talk about were these plants, because I think like this is like the best kind of example of an asset that we can start to break down and really understand how it's built and put together, and then we'll start to expand out from there. But I think this is like the simplest um, asset to start with. By the way, in the scene, like you'll notice, I have the scene here on my ArtStation. Um, you'll notice down here there's like some asset renders that are just used to showcase the assets used to compose the scene. These are actually just live right in the scene. So if you just turn the camera around, in the back here, I've got like this asset display here, and oh, I'm getting some weird flickering here. That's odd. All right, well, there's some bugs here, but anyway, this is like the display, and it's basically just set up back here. I actually just migrated this project to 4.27, so and I turned off a bunch of deprecated features. But this is I just have my assets um, back here, and I have a bunch of cameras set up in the scene. So I just kind of like go through some of my placed cameras, and I'll just look at like this one is camera shot '09. So this is like the shot where I'll take my screenshot for this. And I just have this in my scene. That way, like if I update any lighting or if I update anything in my scene, um, it's updating for my asset shots as well. And I'm probably gonna fix this in a moment. All right, so just forgive the disco bark there. So first, we'll go into kind of how these were created, um, and all of the assets. Well, I wouldn't say all. I would say like 90% of the assets here are done with scanned uh, data, and there's a good chunk of like assets. Like for example, the rocks are just typical kind of like sculpts and texturing and substance painter, but everything else is pretty much using scans. The flowers are also created just by hand, but everything else is scans. All right. Okay, cool. So first, I'll go over some of the equipment I use in the scans. So this is what my equipment looks like. It's pretty simple. It's a DSLR camera. I use a color chart, um, and I have a pair of snips, a black Bristol board that I just kind of fold, and I have the camera bag. And actually, the camera and the color chart were just equipment that I borrowed from the studio. So I just kind of borrowed it for a weekend. I signed it out, and then I returned it. So it's pretty simple equipment. I think like if you were to purchase all this, I think in total you'd probably be spending like maybe 600-700 bucks now because the camera is a bit older. It's probably like 4 or 5 years old. Um, the color chart's 100 bucks. The snips are 10 bucks. So all in all, here you're probably looking at maybe 600-700, and obviously a majority of that's going into the camera. But I've seen great scans with a smartphone, so um, you don't need a whole lot of money for this. But if you wanted to have like a kind of mid level setup, which is what I'd consider, this is kind of like a mid level hobbyist setup. You're probably looking at around maybe 700 bucks on average. and this will last you years. Like we took this camera to Cuba, like through UB. We took it to Miami. We did a lot of scanning in Miami because the biomes are so similar. And like this camera's been through war, so and it still holds up well. So the first thing I want to go over is this plant, as I mentioned, and let me just cue that up. So this is the workflow that I'm going to go over. Basically identifying what you want to capture, getting the parts, processing the parts, building the parts as an HD, baking the parts down into something that's kind of applicable to be used in game, constructing your game ready mesh, and then spitting it back into the engine. So I'll just go over this whole loop, and we'll start with plants. All right. So first off, we have the scan trip. So what I do is I have this folder called raw scans, and then this is essentially me going to a place like a park. We have like a park in the city called High Park, and it's a big park in the middle of Toronto. And I went there one day when it was overcast, and we were just walking, and I would stop every once in a while, throw down the color chart, and snap a bunch of pictures. So this is the result of this is actually half of a scan trip. So this is one half of a scan trip. This was in 2019. So yeah, like I'll just find this tree, and you'll see here, like I'm just taking a bunch of pictures of the tree. So basically this was like the first scan, and my first scan is usually a test scan just to make sure that the camera is calibrated correctly. I'll take a picture of the color chart, and then I'll start taking a picture. And this is just literally me taking a picture up and down of the tree and all the way around the tree. So if I start to kind of scan the tree, this is my process. So I'm going up and down and up and down. And then this will help us get a good scan in whatever it is you're processing the scans in. So the color chart, typically I'll take a picture of the color chart. It's used for two things. One, it's used for scale. If you had a batch processing system in place, there's a way that you can kind of get a sense of the physical scale of what you're scanning by having the chart in the scene. But the main thing that I use this for is to make sure that all my colors are consistent. So basically, when you take a picture of the color chart, there are certain colors in the color chart and also shades in the color chart that are true. So like this is like true white, true black, blue, green, red, etc., etc. So when you open this up in Lightroom, which I'll talk about in a sec, okay, when you open this in Lightroom, what you can do is you can create a profile based on this color checker. And then when you load in the profile, it knows that this is supposed to be blue. It'll color correct the scene, making sure that this is blue, this is red, this is green, etc. So, and it'll also adjust your white balance. So essentially, your scene will all be, the colors will be calibrated to true colors. It knows that this is true blue, so it'll calibrate the image so that this comes out as true blue, this comes out as white, black, etc. So it helps to have that reference point in there because the software will calibrate it. So with regards to the plants, right, and here's like a bunch of like scans that I did on like the terrain, which also made it in the scene. So this is like a scan of the terrain, which ended up being this material here. So this material here was a scan based on this ground. Okay. So yeah, so basically this is just what the photo dump looks like. And then I came across a plant that looked interesting to me because I felt that it was probably something that I can use as like a generic fill for creating some kind of shrubbery and just some general biome fill, and it creates like an interesting silhouette. So the first thing I did was I took a reference picture. This is something I recommend too. Like if you're going to scan something, like I recommend your first couple of pictures should be like, what does this look like? And maybe a couple of different angles of like what this bush looks like. So I just took a couple pictures of what this looks like, and this will help me like recreate it. This is just like reference for me essentially. And then I will look for pieces of the plant that have already fallen off of the tree. Like I don't want to like disturb a live plant, so I'll typically look for pieces of the plant that have already fallen off of the tree, and I'll kind of just like snip those and clean those up. So here, like I probably just snipped the end, and this had already fallen off the tree. So I'll take a couple of samples of the leaves and I'll separate them. And basically here, I'm just trying to create like, if you've ever gone to Megascans and you'll see like an atlas, I'm just trying to create like an atlas of things that I can pull from. And again, my calibrator is here so that I can calibrate the colors of this. And I'm just getting like a really, like a nice resolution photo of what I'm scanning. And in this case, I'm not really like, I'm using the term scanning, but here I'm just really taking nice high res photos because I'm doing most of the processing in Photoshop and in Substance. So here I'm just taking a bunch of images. I have like, there's like some interesting red leaves. I'm trying my best to keep this in a shaded area. You can see that there's some kind of lighting here from the sun. Like it was overcast, but then the sun started coming out. And like, I'm doing this really like, really guerrilla style. I'm just kind of going under the shade of a tree, and I'm just trying to get, I only want bounce light. I don't want, or diffuse light, I should say. I don't want direct lighting because I don't want any, harsh shadows in my images. And then I'm taking some pictures, obviously, of like branches because I'm going to use this to construct the stem. And I'm just going to do this kind of really the old-fashioned way. So this is my initial kind of take from the scan. So then what I do next is, my next step is Photoshop. So basically, I come in to Photoshop and I'll bring in my photos. So literally, like I'll bring in a photo into Photoshop, and this photo here, I'll literally just bring this image into Photoshop. Because I have the black background, I'll crop it. And I'm using a black background, by the way. Like you'll see some people use like a blue versatile board, or you don't want to use green, obviously, because mostly everything you're scanning is green. So you'll probably want to use either blue, white, or black. We don't use blue because one thing that we found is that when we do use blue, you'll get a bit of blue bounce onto your vegetation, even if it's like faint. And unless you have like a perfect overcast day, you'll start to get a little bit of blue bleed onto your leaf. So in all of our scans, basically we just used black because that was the most neutral. There is a little bit of extra time in the cleanup, but it's very nominal. It's not going to make a huge difference. So essentially, like I'll take this into Photoshop and I'll take all my various different leaves. Like I might even take some things like crop it off of the branch, which I probably did here somewhere. Yeah, so like this one here, for example, is this leaf here. So it's literally just like old school marquee select, extract, crop it. And then when I do that, like I just have a green background because in case there's any bleed, like I just want a nice clean background. And as I'm working, it just looks nice and organized and kind of helps me to feel like I'm doing things in an organized manner. So I have my color From my color as well, I'm naturally also creating an opacity, because since I'm already cropping this, I'm creating an opacity. So I'll have my color, I'll have my opacity, and I'll also just create like a very basic height. This is not like a calibrated height by any means, but this does help sometimes for my next step, which is to generate the normal for this. Like sometimes I'll use this as a layer to help generate my normal. But basically, what I really care about is doing my color and my opacity at this point. Next step, Substance Alchemist. Now Substance Sampler, 3D Sampler. In Alchemist, I'm not going to go through this like full out, but I'll show you a quick overview of what this step looks like. All right, so what I'll do is, like, once I generate my HD, I call this HD, by the way. It's just the term that we were using at on some of our projects. And once I generate my HD, I have my color, which you can't see in the previewer here, but this is essentially my base color. So I'll just grab my base color and I'll just drop it into Alchemist. And I'm just going to do image to material. And in this case here, basically, what I'm going to do is just an image to material. And I'll go into like 2D view just so I can see what's happening. So I'm essentially just creating a normal, and I'm just kind of playing with the values. Until I get a result that that I'm happy with, and I just kind of play with these until I have some micro detail that I can work with. Again, remember, this is not our like our low poly in game. This is like we're creating our high poly right now. So we're creating HD elements for our high poly. So what I want to do here is just generate a normal that I can work with, and that'll give me some detail that is going to transfer down onto my low poly. So once I'm done with generating these maps, and here also you can generate a roughness as well. So once I'm done here, I'll have essentially what I'm doing is I'm trying to replicate and recreate that branch. And I've got like a couple of different versions, and I don't always do this, but for some things like the plant, also like some grasses, I'll keep a couple of different elements in the same file. So this is like one element here. So if I hide this and I unhide the other one, this is like my other variation. So like a couple of different variations, and essentially like, oh, and this is also like the trunk that I created the same way. It's just like a basic stem texture that I created. Just the old-fashioned way. Just you have the base color, you generate the normals in Alchemist. So like I've got my high poly that I'm building. So here I'm just kind of building a high poly, and I'm using my references. If you recall, some of these references here, I'm just kind of looking at these and just seeing how the growth pattern is on some of these, like, you know how many leaves are on a branch, how they grow. So are they symmetrical on both sides? So I'm kind of paying attention to all that. And also I'm trying to get a good amount of variation so that I'll have a nice normal map bake from here. And like I mentioned, this is my high poly. Okay, so this is what I'm going to use to bake. And in Speedtree, I have a view that I set up, and this is a view that I set up that I bake. So I bake everything entirely in Speedtree. Speedtree has a great baker. It's really easy, and it creates a really high quality normal. So I bake this from Speedtree. I hide that, and I bake that from Speedtree. So I have two versions: one that's like healthy, and one that's not so healthy. And in this case, also I had a version where I used the red leaves. Right now I'm not using the red leaves, but when I put them into my scene, I didn't like the way that the red looked in my scene. I felt like it stuck out a bit too much because I didn't have many other elements that would help complement. And I just wanted to pull it out at that point. I didn't want to use them. So I create these two. Excuse me. I create these two variations, and then I bake them. So the next step after that is I'm gonna atlas the bakes. So I'm gonna take all my bakes and I'm going to put them all into a texture sheet. So for that, I'm using Substance Designer. And in Substance Designer, like I have my raw bakes. So like this is what the bake looks like from Speedtree. And this bake is actually great, and it gives you the bleed as well after our bake. So we get the full bleed, and it bakes the alpha. Remember, like this is the alpha that I got from my HD alpha. So when I'm creating my Highpoly in here, let me just close Alchemist. So when I'm creating my Highpoly in here, and I'm creating these leaves, so like this is what the leaf will look like. I'm not too worried about the edges of the leaf. I'm not too worried about the edges of the leaf because I know that my alpha is going to take care of those. So really, what I'm worried about is just getting a good amount of geo, getting the stem fitted correctly, and all of these are created entirely inside of Speedtree using the Speedtree modeler. So I don't create this in Max. You could create this in Max or Maya or Blender or whatever you'd like to use. But in this case, like if I can keep everything in one program, I'll do that just because it's simpler than bouncing around for me personally. So yeah, so I have my bakes. And then I have my two different versions. So I've got my healthy one, and I've got my slightly decayed version. And using just simple material transforms and also material blends, I'm just kind of atlasing these two together. Okay, and then I'm using one more material blend to add the stem texture. So I've got like this high level stem here, and I'm using the material blend to get that stem in here. I want the stem in here because it's going to really help me with my low poly. And then this is my output. So basically, this is what I'm going to be spitting out to basically give me now my content to create my low poly. Now from here, so we have the HD. Now I'm going to open up the low poly. So this is the construction of one of my generic plants, and like I have a couple of different versions of these. So these are like the two different versions of the plant. So basically, like if you were to look at the wireframe for this is what it looks like. It's essentially these textures that I ended up atlasing and baking. And again, as soon as I bake that, I load it right into Speedtree. And using this workflow here with creating the meshes directly in Speedtree, I'm basically creating these fronds directly in Speedtree, using the Speedtree generator for the stem, and constructing this plant. And all the while, like that I'm doing this, like I'm obviously looking at my reference. So I'm really trying to kind of recreate this, and obviously, like, trying to create some interesting silhouettes and stuff that's going to work um, well in games. Okay. And yeah, the one step that I forgot to chat about is like when I'm when I'm doing um, my color calibration. Um, for this plant, I'm not doing a whole lot of delighting because it's pretty overcast in here where I'm taking my picture. Like it's everything's in a shaded area, but I am using a custom profile, which I create in Lightroom. This is like really like an optional step. Like you don't really need to do this step, but essentially you would load in the profile for this color checker called X-Rite, and you would do a white balance selector where you pick the white balance, and it would essentially um, create a profile which you can then copy and paste onto everything else in, like, you really have to do it once and you can apply it to every photo, assuming that every photo was taken in the same location within the same general time frame. It should work okay. Otherwise you'll want to create multiple profiles for like different times a day or anytime lighting is changing drastically. um, yeah, so like we can get into Lightroom a lot deeper. My experience with Lightroom is pretty surface level as far as like just using it to kind of apply my color profile to this and then export my images out. But Lightroom's a great program, obviously, with like you can go pretty deep into Lightroom, and it's great for automating things, batching things. Like I said, I created one profile for my terrain. Like you can see, this is called terrain forest floor. So I created my first profile for the floor, and then I applied that profile to my plants because they were taken within like a few minutes of each other. Um, so from photo to Lightroom to creating the HD in Photoshop, Alchemist, the Speedtree to baking. Now we're back here and we're kind of constructing our low poly. So this is actually going to be the one that goes into game. Um, and it's a pretty simple plant. Like and that's why I kind of wanted to showcase this first, because it's probably this is the one that I think, like, if you're gonna start doing vegetation, um, I would recommend personally maybe not starting with something like a large tree, but starting with something like a fern or a plant like this, which is kind of like a hybrid. It has like elements that a fern would have, but it also has some elements of a tree. Like there's like a long stem that you're going to be creating branches off of. So if you were to create vegetation for the first time, this is a great first asset type to create something like this. Um, and essentially here I'm using a bunch of different shape settings um, and to help shape the tree. And I'm spawning my um, my spines, which are used to drive the shaping of these fronds. Okay, so from here, I create two variations of this generic plant, and these get exported out. And again, like as you can see, like very simple geometry, like nothing fancy going on. And then this gets exported into Engine, and this is the asset in Engine. So this gets set up in Engine typical way, and then the wind is actually something that you generate in Speedtree just using the wind wizard. And when you import your Speedtree mesh, uh, when you import your, and again, like all this whole file will be yours to poke around and mess with. You could even, if you'd like, you can just kind of copy this material into your own personal file and just swap the uh, the inputs, and you can use this as a template. It's a very basic material. And then this is the wind. So essentially, it's using a combination of simple grass wind as well as Speedtree. This Speedtree node, this is a node that exists in Unreal, and you're picking the type of wind you'd like, and that's going to give you this wind result. So that's like the basics of our first plan. So like just going from A to Z, it's taking like the most important part in this whole thing, honestly, is just taking a nice picture. And like I said, you don't need really high tech equipment. Like let's just say I didn't have this color chart, and let's say I didn't have my DSLR camera. If I had a decent smartphone and I had a piece of Bristol board like this, you can get this level of quality or better. You don't need a fancy camera. Really, you don't. Um, there's also some great apps that you can download for your phone that will allow you to take raw photos that are not auto adjusted. Like uh, the iPhone has like certain like auto exposure settings that it adds onto your uh, like from your cameras. It makes sure that whenever you're taking a photo, it's going to be auto leveled for you. But in some cases, you don't want it to auto level. Like in these cases, you want to basically control the levels yourself. And there's some apps you can download to help control that. And really, like this could be done with a smartphone. So the most important part is just taking a picture with like when I take a picture and I look at the data, I'm like, okay, cool, I can use that. Um, from there, we just generate a decent normal roughness. And when we do that, we can always do final calibration inside of Substance as well. And then creating our Lowpoly and Speedtree. All right. And although I'm not going to create something here from scratch in this workshop, I have been thinking about creating um, a to Z kind of workflow tutorial in the form of a masterclass. And it'll be basically supplying a photo, and we create this from A to Z just from the initial photo. But this is like like I said, like this is probably our simplest example. So I'd like to now look at something a bit more complicated. So when we're doing vegetation, and I was chatting with Tim about this. Um, typically, you would think like you would start small, like grass, work your way to plant, and then work your way to tree. But um, in my opinion, and like a lot of people that I've worked with will contest to this. Grass is probably the most difficult thing you will build vegetation wise. Grass is super difficult because depending on what you're trying to create, are you trying to create fluffy grass? Are you trying to create tall grass? Are you trying to create short, sparse grass? There's a different method to these different grasses, and each one is going to need a unique approach. And like for example, like on Far Cry 6, Sandra Parling, who was a great artist that I worked with, she basically handled all the grass in the game, and she worked on that almost exclusively. Um, and it's something that like needs a unique approach. So we are going to go into grass, but I'm going to go from plant to tree to grass. So I'm going to save grass for the end because there's a bunch of different kind of nuances that I want to talk about. All right, so that's it for the plant. Next up, I want to go into the process to create a tree. So this is kind of like a two-step process. The first step is, well, I would say it doesn't matter really which one you start with first, but they're like kind of two parallel steps that are eventually going to converge. So you need to first create two different sets of source data. So similar to how we did the first one, let me just cue. Here is the leaf. So similar process, like I have my leaf photos. So on this one, if I go, I think these leaves were, I don't remember exactly where they are in this pile or if they're in the first set or the second set. So I probably won't find the photo, but I think that you kind of get the picture regardless. But there's a bunch of things here also, like you'll notice I just scrolled past a couple things here, like this this kind of branch. I'll come back to this later, but like you'll notice like this branch here is also this one here. So it's also a scanned element that was brought in game. So that one is here. So similar process, like we find a really useful and a nice looking leaf that's going to give us a good amount of variation. So from here, generate the alpha, same thing. We'll spit this into Alchemist, we'll generate a normal. And then for the bark, so here's the interesting step. So for the bark, what I'm going to do, and this is like the bark from the tree. I'll load up Etchysoft, photo scan. So when you're, yeah, like I'll show you the merging. It's actually just all done inside of Speedtree, and oftentimes there are gonna be some seams, but it's I think like the seam stuff is a lot more forgiving than people think, and we'll be able to hide seams fairly simply. But here, like after I take all my photos, so like this is what my photos will look like, for example. So all these blue planes, those are all of my photos. So that's where I've taken pictures. And then this is what I get generated as like a raw scan. So this is like my raw data. This is what gets processed. So I get a high resolution texture. I think in this case it's a 16K texture that I generated, as well as a really high poly model. So I take this, okay, and I export an OBJ and I export a raw texture out of Photoscan. Now there's a program called Metashape, which is like the evolution of this program. So from here, let me load that project up. We have a ZBrush step. So I've generated my HD leaves, so I'm going to leave the leaves alone for now. Okay, so I've generated my HD leaves, and let me put those to the side. Meaning, when I say that, what I mean is I've generated all of these, so I'm going to put those to the side. Okay, so I've generated my normal, my alphas, etc. So I'm going to put that off to the side for a moment. So what I do in here, this is like my trunk, and what I'm doing is essentially I'm just cleaning it up. So you can see I trimmed the top so that it's nice and flush. I trimmed the bottom so it's nice and flush, and I've loaded this into ZBrush, and there might be some details that you want to accentuate. Like this is like a question that comes up a lot, is like, you know, can you sculpt on this? And it's like, yeah, you could totally just, like, let's say you really wanted to accentuate a feature here. There's a certain amount of sculpting you could do on top of this. And sometimes you may want to turn off the texture. And you can see like there's a certain amount of, like, this is how my normal is going to be generated, right? So you would kind of go in and just really accentuate certain parts of the scan that perhaps you want to exaggerate because you think there'll be like interesting features in the normal. So you can go through and spend like a couple hours. When we say like, oh, we polish the scan or we clean up the scan, this is really what we mean. So in this case here, like you can see, I've got some detail here that came out sharp, but this detail came out a little bit soft. So I may go in here and just like sharpen this up a little bit. Something like that. So when I turn on my texture, like I'll get some of these details to just kind of read a little bit sharper. Okay. And I also create a, I use this to just basically generate a basic low poly. And in this case, it's just a matter of duplicating this and doing just a basic Z remesh. So if I just dynamic solo this and I go to geometry, Z remesh, I'll just do a basic Z remesh. All right, so I'll just abort that because it might take a second. But once we do that, what we end up with is this. So this is what we end up with. So we have our Highpoly scan, and then when we Z remesh, we end up with this. Okay. So what I do next is I take this into, in my case, 3ds Max, and I bring in my high poly and my low poly. Let me see if I have those files. I can show you. I have like 6 versions of this bark, so I'll see if I can find the right one. Or actually, I have 9 versions of this bark. So 9 different trees that I like. Some of them I didn't fully process. Like I think 03. Yeah, this one I processed. 04. I did this one too. 05. I didn't do this one. So this one's just photos. All right. So this is not the same tree that we just looked at, but it's a very comparable one. So here, essentially, I have my full scan, right? So this is like my high poly, and it's got a bunch of really, really cool and interesting detail that will transfer. Actually, this may be the one that I used. So this is like the one that has like a bunch of really interesting detail. And then this is the one that I actually sectioned off. Like I chopped this. And then this is where I'm going to apply my unwrap to. And let me see if this one has it. Yeah. So basically you just want this to fit into a square, and you really want to pay attention to the edges. That's the important part, because when we bake this into a square, we want to make sure that the edges tile properly. So this is what the unwrap will look like, because I'm trying to create a tileable bark. This is called, like, the workshop is focusing on modular vegetations, and by modular I mean, like, I want to create a bark that I'm going to be able to like I don't want to have like this really unique trunk. We'll get the uniqueness another way. Like I said, I have a cool technique that I'll show you for kind of planting the assets into the ground. But this is more so creating stuff that's highly reusable and flexible. That's going to allow us to do multiple different versions of an asset, as opposed to like one really specific thing. So this is what the unwrap looks like, and the high and low. So it's really just like, this was created in ZBrush. These were both created in ZBrush as far as like exporting. Here is where I'm just like, oh, this is going to be my tiling part. I really like this detail. As soon as I get lower here, it starts to get too thick, and I start to get some really unique elements that might be too repetitious. So yeah. So I take this and I bake this. So I export low, I export the high, and I bake that. So yeah, so basically here is my bark after it's baked. And I did a bit of delighting here. So essentially some color equalizing, and a bit of removal of some of the lighting. So Substance has pretty good delighting tools. Most of my delighting is done directly in Substance. We tried a bunch of different things for delighting. We tried Unity. We tried we basically settled on Designer. We did a bit of Photoshop, delighting techniques. Ultimately, we settled on delighting in Designer for the most part. So yeah, I have my bark. So now I get basically to this point here where I've got my bark and I've got my leaves. So right now, essentially, where we are is we're right here. So we have this and we have this. So now we're going to get to this. Go back to Speedtree. Be one with the foliage. you should see how many memes we had at work posted up on the different boards of like us being one with the foliage. It's quite funny. So this is what, yeah, totally. So this is what the one of the HD, what we call clusters, may look like. So this is like a Highpoly branch. So essentially, looking at the reference and trying to figure out kind of how the like what the branch patterns like of the tree, and trying to see how the tree grows and how many branches on per tier, and also like just finding different ways to construct the tree. Like, am I going to bake some side views, some top views? So that's all based on my reference. And here, my first thing is like, I just want to create a version of the branch. Like if I were to like break this branch off of the tree, like what's it going to look like? So that's what I'm doing here. So first, I'm just really creating a branch. And again, I have in Speedtree this top-down camera, which is going to allow me to bake all of my textures. So I do this, and I also create a bunch of different smaller ones. So I'll create a bunch of different versions of this. And what I do is I take those into Substance again, and I'm going to atlas all of those bakes. All right, so this is what my texture looks like once it's all atlas. So this is, I have one that I created that was just the dead branch. And you'll notice here, like the texture that I'm using for these small branches is just, it's that, that texture that I baked. So like this is like the one that's going to be on my trunk, and I'm using it also for the small branches. So I have this ready beforehand. You see the one that I showed you guys in Designer. I have this ready beforehand, and then this is going to be used in my my bakes, and it's also going to be in my tree. So they're going to match up in terms of color and like detail. So this is my my branch, and you'll notice like here as well, like I'm just kind of spawning the leaves that I created onto the ends, and then the leaves are just this. They're all created again in Speedtree. So this is what my atlas looks like, and this is all the various bakes that I've done. And like I said, this looks complex, but it's only because I'm carrying a hefty amount of textures. Like these textures are just the bakes. So this is just the bakes of the branches that I showed you in Speedtree. So these are just the bakes, and I plug these into a material transform. And then when I'm plugging these in, you can see like I'm really just, after I do my initial setup, I'm just plugging one node into the material blend. And I'm using the transform to move it to the corner. So when I'm done doing all of my different moves, and then I'm going to be basically here, I'm going to be blending in another one. And then from here, I'm going to be blending in another one. And then from here, I'm going to blend in the dead branch. And basically just full, side, small, sparse, and dead. So those are my 4 different cluster bakes. You don't have to have 4, you can have fewer. Like, I think I only ended up using like 3 of these actually. And in fact, if you look at this, so this is like a kind of small, I would say like a little tip here. So when we're creating this, this one here is the small one, but when I created this sparse one, I noticed that like if I just cut my leaf off of here, like I can just use that little piece, I'm essentially getting what I get here. This is just like a higher resolution version because it's taking up more space on the texture sheet. So this will work with like the bushes that I created, like the small bushes, which I'll show you in a sec. So I have all these, and then these are my final outputs. So this is my normal. So this normal includes the micro normal from my HD. So like this normal gets packed in to this normal, and then it gets all baked down. So you can see like these are all baked from Speedtree, like pretty nice normals. Like we have really good range, nice variety, really clean normals. So I have these baked. I export my textures out of Designer, and then this is going to be my my leaf atlas. So I take these now into Speedtree, and I start to build the tree, and I start to build the branches off of the tree. And I know that you know, if there's any questions about seams or whatnot, you can see here that I'm just doing real basic alignment that Speedtree provides to align the texture as best as possible. There's a little bit of stretching that happens at these junction points, which we can definitely try to fix as best as possible. But to be honest with you, like with a lot of this stuff, it's really like not too noticeable with regards to like actually seeing these in game. It's quite forgiving. I think a lot of worry and effort goes into thinking about, you know, like what we're gonna do with the seams or whatnot. But you know, a lot of that is like, especially for branches up here, like it's really not noticeable. Like there's so much happening on the tree already that it doesn't become an issue. But if you really wanted to um, get this to blend perfectly, Speedtree has some great nodes for blending. The one thing to consider is that when you do any unique blending in Speedtree, most of the time you're going to be adding an additional draw call to the tree in game because it's going to create a material blend between the branch and the tree. So that material blend is going to be essentially an alpha blend of the two different junction points. So it's going to actually create a separate material. You can use the same textures, but it's going to be a separate material to blend that. And if you're doing a vegetation heavy game, that may not be possible to do. Like you may not be able to do that. So yeah, so basically we've got our tree here, and the tree is composed of a bunch of different parts. So if you see here, so I'm just going to break this down into like the most basic part first. So these are the dead branches, right? So let me just hide the dead branches. This is the actual physical geo. So when I have this dead branch here, what I'm doing with the dead branch on the tree is that's going to be like my first line of noise on the branch. And I'm just going to use that to help create a little bit of noise. So this is going to basically try to blur the line between where the actual physical geo is and where the planes are. And I can adjust kind of how many of these I'm spawning to help control my budget. But essentially, like, this is going to be me trying to, like, and again, if we're using the same texture, we get a pretty decent blend into the tree. But this is me just trying to distract the eye away from, okay, this is 3D, this is 2D. And I'm just trying to, like, do some creative distraction there. And then I'm just starting to layer some of the leaves onto the tree. So like I start to layer a little bit and I start to build up some layering with breaking the plane as well. Like I don't want it to just be a plane, so I'm curving it and I'm also spawning some additional leaves on the cluster in different directions to give the full illusion in the cluster. So these are 2D planes, but by spawning things in different angles, you can get some really nice looks and you can get some nice fullness happening on the tree. And then this is the final result. So this tree is sitting at about 15K for the high LED. And I always get this question, like what's my polygon budget for a tree? And it's like that question is so open-ended. It totally depends on the final use case. Like, is this tree going to be used in an open world game? How many are you going to spawn? Is it a linear game? Um, is it for PS5? Is it for PS4? Um, you know, it completely depends. Like a game that's like single player where you just have like a few trees, you can have like really massive looking trees that are like 30, 40, 50K. Um, if you're going to be doing like dense jungles and you need a game to run on PS4 and PS5, you want it to run at 60 frames per second on PS5. Like in general, trees on Far Cry were at roughly between 10K to maybe 15K. We had some that were more, but we couldn't place those as often. So it totally depends. It totally depends. If you're doing something for your portfolio, I would recommend just pushing the boundary a little bit and make it look beautiful. Obviously, you don't want to go with like a 200K or 300K tree if you're trying to show an example of your ability to make game assets. But at the same time, like I love, especially like, I've reviewed a ton of portfolios, I've interviewed a ton of people. Um, One thing that stands out is someone's ability to create beautiful looking artwork. So I think that the beauty should always be first and foremost. Um, Showcasing a knowledge of optimization is very important, and geometry usage, but it's not 100% relevant to like completely optimize your geometry if you don't know what you're optimizing for. Like, what platform are you optimizing for? What engine? What are the restraints of that game? I've worked on 6 or 7 different projects now, and each project has had different constraints. Even projects within the same brand have had different constraints. So you really want to make sure that you're not over thinking the optimization. Create something beautiful within general budgetary constraints. Like if you made a tree that's 30K polys and it's just one tree in a diorama with grass, like there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. Even if you created a 50K tree. Now, if you think that you're going to take that tree and spit it into a mobile game, obviously that's not going to work. So we're going to need to definitely have a bit of an understanding there, but beauty comes first. And making, in my opinion, making something beautiful with general knowledge of the constraints, because you'll be learning what constraints that engine has for that particular game you're working on. And I think that's easier to teach than it is just the core skill of creating something that looks beautiful. So this is the build of the tree, and I have a couple different versions of this. So I think I created 5 different versions of this tree, so I'll just load in a couple more. This is probably the heaviest one that I created. And this is like a dual, like a bifurcating branch. And there's like something interesting happening with the base here that I'm going to want to talk about. And I'm going to want to talk about this when we get into the engine. I'm just going to hide that for a sec. So this is the tileable texture. So this is just 100% tileable on the tree. And this is like a very dense tree, as you can see. I think actually the one that I used, we'll take a look at it. I optimized it down to, I think, 30K. But yeah, this is the tree, and I wanted to talk a bit about this because if you look at the trees in Engine, it's kind of hard here with this flickering. All right, so something to do with the parallax is busted. So I just turned off in the material. I just set my parallax height to 0 on the palm. So I have like a palm mapping, and I just set that to 0. So in here, for example, like if we look at the base here, So what I wanted to do with the tree was have a way to like kind of root the tree into the ground, and create like a connection, into the ground for the tree. Um, so one thing that I wanted to do was create like a nice way to kind of like root the tree, no pun intended, into the ground. So with this here, one awesome node inside of Speedtree is the shell node. So if you look at, let me use the smaller tree. So this shell node here, basically what it does is it creates a duplicate of your geometry as a shell, and it basically extracts that. And then what you could do is, in this case, I'm using a decal. I'm using a decal on the base. So this is decal is my trunk texture with a overlay of like a unique base, and I'm kind of just mixing those together here. And let me just fix this for a sec. Yeah, so essentially I have this decal that is sitting on top of the tree. So like this is without it. You can see how much it's doing for the tree to really plant the tree into the ground. Like this is the kind of iconic base of most um, birch trees. And in this case, I have this decal that I created. And this is the alpha for the decal. And then this is like my bark with just a little bit of an overlay on the bottom. And I'm just fading it off. And in the engine, you can see that it creates this really nice effect. And this is like a decal that I can use on every tree that I add. And the reason why I did it this way is because this gives me a texture that I can tile on saplings. I can tile this texture on trees. I can tile this texture without issue, like just this base texture. I can tile this freely on anything, and I'll have that decal to use as a base, and I can really get that uniqueness on the ground. And then like that same bark I can use on these little saplings. So yeah, and the decal is created using Designer. So I have like a bunch of scans that I did, and one of the scans just had a really interesting base, and then one of them I just took that and I just overlaid it in Designer, and you can see the alpha is just a basic alpha. So this is what the decal looks like in terms of the texture. And actually, I might have mixed in some photos as well for this. I don't remember, it was so long ago. But and then just generating the normals in Substance and overlaying them over my base normal. And then when you like I mentioned, if you look at I think my the alpha is in here, I believe, the way I packed it. So that's the alpha. So if you look, the alpha is real basic. It's just full on and then it fades off completely. And then that allows and then this is just my channel pack textures where I'm packing my roughness and some of my different maps. And I did a unique channel pack for the decal. Um, so yeah, so this is like literally just a shell decal. Like you can see if I, take this. That's what it is when you import it into Unreal. And then with the decal applied over top. I can't really talk, like I can't talk up this technique enough. It's just awesome. Like great technique. That is a basic, it's a pretty standard technique. Like I didn't invent it or anything. So I don't want it to come across as that. It's a pretty standard technique, but I just can't stress enough how useful of a technique it is. So yeah, so then essentially I have my trees and my plants now and I'm scattering them. And when I scatter them into the scene, I'm just trying to create this like ramp of like age of the trees. I'm just trying to ramp the forest. And then like we'll get into some grass now as well. So for grass, this is the workflow. So basically, we go from taking some high res pictures of grass. So this is what the grass HD will look like. So again, the same way, alpha, I have my color, I have a basic height, running those through Alchemist to generate my my normal, etc. So from here, now I go on to start to create my Highpoly. So here I'm just kind of creating, like I'm trying to imagine like what it would look like if I grabbed a like bunch of grass from the ground and just pulled it out of the ground. So that's basically what I'm doing here with some of these grasses, while also trying to get some interesting shapes going. All right, so basically near the end, like, and this is just creating the fronds to follow the spines. I'm not going to get into this too deep because we can spend like 2-3 hours just on this, but in this case here, I'm using spines. So this is, if you haven't used Speedtree, I'm using these spines, which are essentially like branches, as paths, essentially. And what we do with the path is this is used as a guide for the geo to follow. So this geo here is basically just like a plane that is following a path. This grass doesn't have this shape coming into Speedtree. It gets shaped in Speedtree. All right, so once I have this, bake it all, bake all the things, and then I atlas it again. So again, this looks daunting, but it's only because a majority of these nodes are essentially the bakes that I'm moving around. Okay, so I'm atlasing these bakes, and this is kind of what it looks like. And like I said, like this is all baked in Speedtree, and you can see like we get some really nice volume to that normal. Like there's some really nice volume there. Another trick that I like to do that I forgot to mention is I like to bake a shadow map from Speedtree. Like it's not a default setting, so you have to actually turn them on. But I like to bake a shadow map. What this does is this gives me like lift on the branches, on the leaves rather. Let me try to find one that's a bit more obvious. So here's the shadow map. And I basically mix that with my AO. So I multiply the shadow map into my AO. This is, I would say, maybe a little bit more of an advanced technique, but good to know anyways. Like not 100% crucially necessary. But I'll show you what this does, which is really nice. So when you're creating your cards, you see this there. That's the shadow map working. So like, and the nice thing by mixing it in your AO is that it's gonna also like come and go with your AO calculation. And you can see here that like it's creating real nice separation between some of these leaves, and it's really creating a sense of layering that you wouldn't otherwise have without that shadow map. So small tip, but I also added that into the grass as well. And you know, I've seen some people put it into the base color as well. I know technically it's not PBR, but when we're dealing with vegetation, we're not really dealing with like full PBR the same way we are when we're dealing with like, you know, other types of assets. Vegetation is still like we do have some rules, general rules, but we don't have as strict a guide with PBR. But anyway, as with all rules, when you know what they do, we can break them and bend them. So the shadow map here is just giving me a bit of interesting shadow between some of my blades of grass, and that shadow is coming by way of a shadow map. So that's the shadow map for the grass. Cool little tip there. So here's my my grass blades, and as I'm doing this, I'm kind of like throughout, and you'll get better with this as you do more vegetation. But as I'm working on this, and by the way, this is my subsurface, so it's not supposed to be that orange. So as I'm doing this, I'm looking at like, okay, if I'm gonna make this as geometry, like I'm trying to find the most optimal way to cut it. So you can see like that, I'm kind of losing a little bit of detail there. So it's probably a good idea if you were trying to optimize this for a game to maybe lose this piece on the Highpoly. That way you can get, you know, a perfectly optimized cut coming across there. But yeah, all the while I'm building this, there's a few times where I kind of just take this and I do a quick little paint over and just see how many triangles is this actually going to cost me. So I'm trying to do that the entire way. This is probably going to be my most expensive one. And then also here, talking about optimization, we're using quite a bit of alpha overdraw. So some alpha that we aren't using for anything. It's just a transparent pixel, which is the expensive part. So the actual opaque pixel is not the expensive part. It's the transparent pixel that's expensive. So we want to try to minimize that as much as possible. Again, here I'm having fun, so I'm not going to like put those constraints on myself, and I would recommend you do the same. But as you're learning vegetation and you're diving deeper, you want to make sure that your transparent pixel usage on a card is as minimal as possible. So it's not the plane that's expensive, it's the transparent part of the plane. If there's an opaque part of the plane, meaning a part that is not being cut out. So in here, the parts that you see are not the expensive part. It's the parts that you don't see that are expensive. And then from here, let's go into some of our low polys. Okay, I don't want to burn too much time on this. I can't find the grass file. It's so annoying. But regardless, let me jump into Unreal and just showcase what I was going to showcase. So basically, the way that I broke this up is a few different grass meshes. So I have here like grass lush, which is a patch. Generally, we kept our grass to around like in our budget was around like 600 tries per cluster. So I think I kept it around 600 or 800 here. Not on purpose, just that's all I needed. Otherwise, it got too dense, too thick. Um, and so I created a few different versions here. So I've got grass lush. I have grass dry, generic, semi-dry, sparse, trail, and ground clovers. And this is also a weed kind of uh, element. And I'm just creating these separate, but when I spawn them, I mix them together in a certain distribution that I see fit based on my references um, and whatever else, like what look I'm trying to go for, etc. So these are like a few different looks here um, for the grass. And then I have these little clovers, which is another mesh um, based on a same thing, based on a scan that I did. Um, and then we have these flowers, which these are probably the 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 heaviest as far as poly count, just because it's a smaller cluster and I'm spawning a lot of that. But if you look at the scene here, like here, for example, when you're mixing them all, um, because I have them all separate and I have them all, like I have control over them independently, placing by hand, but most of these I'm painting using the foliage tool. And then another cool thing here, I think is just interesting to talk about, is like the path. So the path here is done with spline, and the mesh for the path is pretty basic. I'll load that up in a second. But the path here is essentially a landscape tool, and it's a spline. So you can see here. And I'm using my terrain texture, and I'm blending my terrain texture into the edge, and I'm using some vertex blending here. And then to blend this back into the ground, because it's covered so much by grass, you don't really notice so much. But otherwise, if like the grass was missing, um, you can see here, if the grass was missing, you would kind of see a bit of a differentiation between the two. But when you have everything mixed together with the lighting, whatnot, you don't notice that so much. Um, yeah, and I also tried to make it somewhat to the Unreal game scale. So if you guys do decide to jump in and run around, you'll see how things are put together. That's about it. One more cool thing, I guess, is the back here. These are just the smaller rocks that I built. It's just all these smaller rocks, just scaled up, huge, and just grouped. So like if you'll see it's just small rocks made to look big. And because your screenshot angles are like this, like it's really all you need over there. I've tagged a few things as well. Like I said, I'll make this project available to everyone. And there's like some stuff here that will describe a bit of what I'm talking about. So that's it. We can move into some question stuff.
Thank you so much, Billy Matjiunis, for taking the time to share this amazing workshop with us at Beyond Extent. Make sure to check out Billy's work in the description below. We also want to throw out a big thank you to all of our Patreon supporters. These workshops are funded and made possible because of your support. If you want to participate in these workshops live, are looking to grow your skills as an environment artist, or just want to be part of an exciting community, then head on over to beyondextent.com to get started and get access to our Discord community. See you there!